Hi folks, welcome back to DNN Custom Creations. I'd like to start a series of videos. I've got my Langmuir plasma table in. Finally, I'm stoked. And I'd like to start a series of videos that provide maybe some tips and tricks during the assembly. I'd like it to be a comprehensive set of videos. Now I say that sounds somewhat arrogant, but what I'm hoping is that other people in their assembly process, as they find things that work well for them, that we can kind of collaboratively put some of these videos together. It really helps some of the new folks that are getting their tables not have to learn all of the things and the tricks that we've learned. So I'm going to start doing that. The first thing I want to do is actually assembling the frame itself. With all those pieces together, it was difficult to try and think of how am I going to hold all these without somebody helping me while I assemble the table. So I'm going to show you the process that I used. It may work for others. It may be something that will be helpful. So I'll be right back and show you now the table. I had the idea of doing this tips, and my original intent or thinking was that I would have small segments, so as you went through the assembly manual, you'd get to chapter 3, for instance, and I'd have tips on chapter 3. The problem was that as I went through the assembly process, sometimes I was in a later section and realized, oh man, I should have done something way back in an earlier section. And so it was hard to put these things together in a good sequential order. I guess my recommendation would be I'm going to put them all in one video, and maybe you want to just watch them all so that as you then get to the sections where I refer to, you can possibly be reminded and either use the tip or don't use the tip, whatever. So I really couldn't find a way of putting them in a good sequential order. I attempted to at the intro of each of the little tips, you'll know what chapter and what paragraph I'm in. But again, maybe I'm down in chapter 8 and I say, you know what, if in chapter 3 you would have done this, now that you're in chapter 8 would have been easier. So sorry about that, but hopefully the tips will still be able to help you out. Thanks. Okay, you can see that the frame is already kind of put together somewhat. I thought of doing these videos after I already did this, but the thing I want to point out here is how I have supported the long frame members on some, in this particular case, a cart, and with those on there, I can now assemble each corner without any problem at all. So you could use, I think you could probably use sawhorses, you could use anything that will support that and allow those members to hang down or across it while you do the assembly, and you don't need an extra person there trying to hold on for you. Okay, I'm gonna start a new video here, and we'll talk about the next thing. Okay, the next thing I want to talk about is squaring the table. This is important so that your X and Y axis is moved accurately. They tell you, first of all, to try and use some sort of a framing square or an angle that will make sure that you're accurate on the table's squareness. But the two levels of these various pieces make it a little difficult to try and ensure using a square or something that you're accurately square. And it's important that it happen that you get that square, because they ask you to measure the lengths of the two sides and that make sure that those are accurate and equal, so L1 and L2. And you can see in the top picture they're square, but on the bottom picture you can have the same length of L1 and L2 and yet not be square. And so this is what they're trying to achieve. First, your L1, L2, make sure that's accurate, but then you need to make sure that the next part that you do have a square. So if you find that using the framing square or some other square is a little bit difficult, get it as close as you can. And then one of the most accurate ways of ensuring squareness is to use a tape measure, and go from one corner to a corner, look at the measurement, take an accurate reading, and then do the same thing going the other direction. And as long as those things are right on, you can get them right on. I mean, even within a 64th of an inch, that pretty well ensures that you are square. So squaring the table, if you get it close with a framing square or some other kind of square, and then come back and use the corner to corner measurement, that'll ensure your squareness. Okay, this step we're going to talk about assembling the Y-axis rails along with the bearing blocks. You see that I've already installed the stanchions, and I recommend that you do those first before you install the rail, because that will help in this next step. There's a couple of things. Notice that on the rails themselves there is a large hole on these, and if you remember in the assembly of the legs, two of the legs in opposite corners have three small holes drilled for the electronics, whether you want to mount the electronics here or you want to mount the electronics on the other side. On that leg, you need to make sure that this large hole is there, because that's where some of the cabling will go. So you can try and put the bearing block on this rail and then, put it on. That works fine, but what I found worked pretty good was, grab a bolt, is just going ahead and getting one corner assembled. Just hand tight, and then that acts like a pivot, and then you can take the bearing assembly and slide it onto that rail without trying to fumble around and keep everything together. Once you have it that way, then put a bolt in the opposite end. And then you're good to go. Put the rest of the bolts in and continue to follow the instructions. There are a number of situations where they want you to pass a screw through one of the rails out the other side. So in this particular case, so you can mount the bearing mount. And they recommend that you're going to do that you wrap some tape around those so that they don't fall off. That's a little bit of a hassle. Let me show you one option that may work for you, and most people probably already know. This happens to be a magnet out of an old computer hard drive. I've got some really strong magnets in those things, and I tear them apart every time I can get my hands on them. But if you just basically take your hex key wrench and drag it across that a magnet, any strong magnet, a number of times in the same direction, well, then it becomes magnetic. And so you can use that then to hold on to that as you pass it through the various passageways. So if that helps, great. All right, thanks. Okay, section 4 in the assembly instructions, paragraph A3. Talk about securing the Z-axis assembly to the X-axis carriage. And they talk about making sure that the key protrusion on the back of the Z-axis assembly fits snugly in the shallow slot in the X-axis assembly. What they're talking about is this little right here, that the black portion here has a key and that fits into this slot. Now, from tips and tricks, when you get ready to put the two screws in, there's one of them that you're seeing now. If you have sockets or hex wrenches with the ball end, it's going to make it a lot easier, because this rail is so close that if you don't have that, it's going to be a little bit difficult. It can be done, it's not a big problem. But what I wanted to point out is that once you get that tightened down and you get ready to secure it, there's not much room on this key to give you the torque that you need. And so one of the easiest ways is just take a simple wrench
closed-end wrench, and use that to give yourself some torque power. Okay, don't crank down on it so hard that you're gonna twist your key or something like that. But give it a little bit of a snug touch. But that'll help you get the torque, tightening torque that you need. Okay. Okay, let's talk about the next part, which is attaching the XZ axis assembly onto the gantry tube. And they want you to do that before you mount it onto the carriage. They also want you to mount the lead screws, holders, mounts, etc. It almost requires you to have a nice, clean, wide bench to do that. Most of us have pretty cluttered benches. So I found that it was actually to go, instead of to B, go on to step C and mount the rail and axis assembly onto the frame, just finger tight, and then come back and do the mounts and some of the things that they wanted you to do in B. So if you lay that rail on top of the two mounts without securing them, the weight of that can be act like a fulcrum and sort of twist your tube, and it could fall off. Wouldn't be a good thing. So go ahead and put in the 4 bolts and tubes that are required to secure it, and then you can work on the rest of it. Okay. Okay, section 4, part B2 and B3 have a little statement in there about the length of the motor mounts, and it's easy to skip over. I did it already. I grabbed the wrong one and had to remove it and replace it. But so here you can see the height difference. The X is always shorter, and in addition, if you notice the spacing of the holes here for the mounting, the 2 and the Y are closer together, and the 1 in the X is wider. That's actually what led me to realize my problem when I couldn't get the screws in the holes because they were the wrong ones and the spacing was off. The other thing I might have to take back, now that I've mounted the rail to the bearing blocks so that I could work on it without worrying about it tipping over, and wondered why they had not asked us to do that initially. I began to realize that when you're working on the screws here, well, your hex wrench can interfere with your bearing blocks, and so that's probably why they recommend that you do that. I happen to have hex wrenches that are straight shaft that I can use to go ahead and mount the bearing box on this other side, and then tighten them with the angled version of that. So that might be why they say that. So you can use a shorter hex wrench, or if you've got some straight ones, that'll work too. Okay, thanks. Well, to ease my situation of being able to get hex wrenches here when it's close to the bearing block, this side was not too bad, but regardless, I loosened these. Now they're still there so that this can't tip and have a problem with the Z-axis. But that allowed me on this side then to raise this up high enough so that I could go ahead and tighten the screws for that bearing or motor mount. So that's how I solved my dilemma after realizing that that's why they asked us to do the first part A there before we did B. But regardless, you can get it on there, and then you can put the bolts back on this side and do the same on the other side if you decide to work it that way. Okay, thanks. Okay, let's see if we can figure out how to do this next section, which is section 5, Y-axis adjustment, and paragraphs A1 through A4. There's a couple of things. Make sure that the entire backing of this plate is loose. so that this, basically, this can move wherever it needs to move. Make sure those are loose. Then they talk about the bearing blocks, that 2 of them are fixed and 2 of them are adjustable. Obviously, the fixed ones are down here, and there's also this one that you may not be able to see very well in the back. And you'll notice that if you happen to put a wrench on those are already tightened. And the 2 adjustable ones, at least on mine, they already came a little bit loose. And so basically they're saying that tighten these up, not real tight obviously, but seat them. All right, so those are seated, and then back those off a 1/4 of a turn. So there's a 1/4 on that one, 1/4 on that one. Then they want you to adjust this set screw, which is basically going to move this bearing block down, raising the bottom up, and you want to do that till at least one of the bearings on the bottom is touching the bottom of this rail. And so I bring it up until I'm feeling both of those now. One of them turns fairly freely, but the other one is a little bit snug. So I'm gonna back that off a little bit. And so that appears to be a pretty good adjustment. I'm not gonna tighten these 2 yet until I do the same thing on this side. And then once I have that ready to go, then I'll tighten these set screws here. So here again, I'm going to seat them, and then back them off a 1/4 turn. And I'll do the same thing here as I did on top, where as I turn it in, if I feel on the back side of that, I got one now that is pretty tight, it's not moving very freely. And so I back that off a little bit until it starts to move. And then I'm checking again on the bottom, make sure nothing has changed. And now I'll go ahead and snug these up. Now once I've done that, I'll kind of feel and make sure everything turns with just a little bit of movement or a little bit of force. And if they're too tight, like that one now has become too tight. See how tight those are? I can't move those. And same thing here. So I need to back off on those, because in tightening down the set screws, I've now tightened them down to the point where the adjustment is no longer correct. So I'll back off on those, 1/4 of a turn again, repeat that process until everything has just a little bit of a light drag on at least one of the 2. So they don't both have to be the same, but at least one should turn freely, another one just a little bit of a drag. Okay? Thanks. Way back in section 4, B1, one of the things they want you to do is to put the X-axis lead screw bearing mount into the rail. But they don't ask you to put the bearing in. So then later on, quite a ways later on, after you put the water pan in and the slats and etc., well, then they get to installing the lead screw bearing mounts, and particularly the Y, because you've already done the X. But in that section 9, part in B1, now they tell you to put the bearing in. Well, it's a lot easier to do that when it's not mounted to the rail. So I recommend way back in section 4, where you're getting ready to put that mount on the rail, go ahead and put the bearing in. So it's just a little bit easier. Here you can see now that it's already mounted to that rail. It's just, if the bearing is a little bit trouble seating, maybe the anodizing left it, created a little bit of an interference fit or press fit. Well, it's pretty hard to then work with it that way. They say use a C-clamp. That's a little bit crude because you might mar up the back side of the mount. So it's just a lot easier to do that when it's on your bench, and, you know, maybe a little arbor press, or, you know, put it in a vise with something that's not gonna mar it up. It's just easier to do it that way than to try and do it once it's already mounted, okay? Okay, let's talk about some things that might help in section 13, which is installing the frame reinforcements. So here you see one of the gussets, and here's one that's been installed on the frame. See the both sides. And the problem with these is they want you to put these in with self tapping screws, which is fine. And on the bottom ones, you can see it's real easy to get to. But as you get up here, you see you begin to lose some distance, and you wind up having to turn your drill to an acute angle, or an angle that's not appropriate, or not not helpful to getting the screws installed. So the recommendation is to put the gusset up there and then mark the locations where those holes are, and with no pan, you can sit underneath here and pre-drill those holes, both on the sides and on the top. The only caution is that you need to make sure that the leg is pretty straight when you're marking those holes. Otherwise, when you go ahead and get the holes drilled and try and put the gusset in place, it's not going to line up. One way that you might want to do that is to do the easy one, you know, put the one in the bottom and the farthest one out on the upper rail, and go ahead and snug those down with the self-tapping screws, and then mark the other holes, remove those 2 screws, and then go ahead and drill the other holes. Okay, found that a lot easier than trying to use a long extension, you know, to try and get into those. It's just a little awkward. So mark them, drill them, and then go ahead and put your self-tapping screws in. Thanks.